Hey, everybody, welcome to Show Me the Meaning Live. This, of course, is a podcast that explores the deeper meaning behind the movies we love. I'm your co host, Raymond Creamer. With me, as always, great Austin Hayden.
Uh,
Austin, how you doing?
I'm all right. I'm all right. I had an early morning this morning. Been talking with fucking lawyers and all kinds of fun things to try to
Mm-hmm.
do the business side of the entertainment world. And you know what? It's not as fun. It's not as fun as just making independent films, micro budget films with your friends. That is the more fun part.
They don't call it show business for nothing, folks.
One of my producing partners, he says it's called show business, and show is only 4 letters in that phrase. And I'm like, God damn it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really insightful. I'm gonna pocket that bad boy.
Yeah.
Just people falling asleep halfway through that sentence being, they call it show business, and show is only
It's only
4
4
letters.
letters.
It
Yeah.
reminds me of what's the bit in Shaun of the Dead where he goes, "There's no I in team, but there is an I in meat pie, and meat is an anagram of team," and everyone's completely checked out.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm glad to
We,
be talking movies. I'm glad to be talking movies. I'm glad to be talking about the meaning behind movies. I'm glad to be talking about
mhm.
movies that are so quintessentially Reagan's America
Mm,
because that is just one of my favorite topics to talk about. So I'm
sure it
very
was.
happy that we're
I
going to
was
get to
just
that.
about to say that we're changing things up from our last 2 bummer episodes,
Yeah.
and now you're dragging us straight into the mud. Um, before we get into this, we got some
Yeah.
housekeeping right up top here. And I know that people love this, so everyone's turning up the volume right now. This is Wisecrack 2, okay? This isn't your fucking grandfather's Wisecrack.
That's right.
Yeah, leave the philosophy at the door. This is all movies all the time, baby. Wisecrack 2, if you're watching this, you already know. If you're not, tune in next week, Tuesday at 7 p.m. We're usually 5 p.m. streaming this show, but we're going to be 7 p.m. one more week. Here at youtube.com/ at wisecrack_2. We stream every Tuesday, once again, usually at 5 p.m. Pacific, but next week it's going to be 7 p.m. One last week, that's Pacific time. Also, we have a letterboxed for the show. This
Oh,
is at
shit.
SMTM Pod on Letterboxd. Follow us there. I don't know if I should peel back the curtain like this, but whatever. I went
Yeah.
on the SMTM Letterboxd this past weekend. Did a
I'm gonna go
little
right now. Oh.
did a little cleaning up over there, tidying things
Okay,
up.
wait. Hold on. I'm going. I'm going.
I logged the movies that we've watched so far. I'm looking forward to Letterboxd won't give you stats until you've logged 10 movies in a year. So after this episode, I think we will have logged 9 movies on the Letterboxd. And then next week, when we come back to talk Gladiator 2, we'll finally get our precious stats. I think I know
Okay.
it's just going to say your most watched director is John Hughes with 2 movies.
Okay, so we've got our favorite films so far. Halloween because Michael Myers won the slasher
Michael Myers
bracket,
won the slasher bracket,
and The
and The
Substance
Substance
won in the head-to-head with Longlegs. So that
exactly.
means the favorite films is essentially we're building a Show Me the Meaning canon. Does that mean today we're also gonna be adding a new entrant
The
into the
canon
canon?
is going to expand. Yes, the halls of
Okay.
Valhalla will be open to one of these John Hughes films, either The Breakfast Club or Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
And will we do
But before
something
we
like
get to
maybe
that, a
like
little more
oh, wait, real quick.
housekeeping.
Yeah, well, this is what I was gonna say, housekeeping wise, with the letterboxd, will we do something that like maybe quarterly, we look back at all the films we did over the past quarter and we do a vote, like an audience vote to say
What, to
which one
expand the
of these.
canon?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
It's something that we're gonna have to figure out because obviously we have a certain I don't want to call it like pressure or anything, but we've been encouraged to cover more recent movies.
Yeah,
So if we're doing that, we're going to end up with a canon that is just like
yeah.
half movies from this year and half movies from next year.
Well, that's why we get to
um
do these fun ones like today, where we dip back into the
exactly.
'80s, and then
And
we'll
that's
flesh it
so
out, and
we're feeling
yeah.
it out a little bit, but I
Uh,
like doing things this way because it gives folks not only the opportunity to vote on things, but it allows us to bring stuff like, look, it's not like these movies aren't terribly obscure, everyone's seen The Breakfast Club. Um, but it still gives us an opportunity to do stuff to reach back a little bit rather than just like every single movie in the Wisecrack Halls of Valhalla is from 2024. Um, but
for
we'll
the sake
see.
of,
I
like,
mean,
art house cred, can we every once in a while just, like, choose one of our favorites? Like, I can just throw in a
stick 'em in the
Belatar
cage.
film. Yeah, yeah, just to put it in there so that people
Well,
know when they stumble across our page that we're real nerdy
I was
cinephiles
also
as well.
because we can publish lists. I was actually going to reach out to you and say like, do you want to put together a list of like 10 movies Austin says everyone must see?
Well, I was
Like
just how they do the Letterboxd
10
4
10
to
movies for
people?
the for the armchair philosopher, something like
Well,
that.
I sometimes think, like, if I were to do a Letterboxd 4, like, I don't think I would do, like, "Well, I'm
Tougher.
gonna go full art house to make sure,
Sure.
like, that I get that I,
What
am
would
on
you have? You'd have
everybody's."
Top Gun. Let me see if I can
Oh,
guess your
so
4.
okay.
It would
Yeah.
be Top Gun, obviously. Then you would have what's your Belatar pick? Because you would have one.
The Turin
Um,
Horse.
the Turin Horse. I was trying to think of. All I could hear in my head was Satan Tango. um, so Top Gun, Turin Horse, Wings of Desire, and then the fourth one. I feel like you would get cute with it. You would put in like a Bond or something like that.
I haven't
You would put
decided.
something that's a little more cheeky or a little more mainstream.
Yeah, I wanna go
Um,
mainstream because I figure
yeah,
Top Gun is, like, my childhood. That's, like, that's the thing that, like, made me a
sure,
movie lover, right? And then I would go, like, full art house, and then I would go, like, semi art house, but still, like, a accessible film with Wings of
sure.
Desire. And then for the last one, I'd wanna go something that is just mainstream and that everybody loves, but that's also, like, a really great movie like, for me, is like I was thinking actually, like, if I went on the heavier side, then the film that keeps popping around in my mind is, like, Apocalypse Now. That's not as
Hmm.
cute, though. That's not as cute, though, but
Well, but
but,
it's one of
like
those movies that still feels safe. Like no one's ever going to be like, "Oh,
yeah.
that's a bad choice" or whatever.
And
This is
honestly, every time I watch it, I come away from it and I'm like, "That might be the best movie ever." Like, every time I
it's
watch it, I
certainly
do
one of the
think that.
most movies ever. It's one of those films where
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, sincerely, like I mean it as a
Yeah.
compliment. It's one of those films that you watch and you think to yourself like, God, if somebody set the 70s on fire and this was the only movie that survived, you could do worse. It's one of those it's like it kind of perfectly encapsulates that moment in cinematic history, or at least Western cinematic history. The sort of uh, escalation of the new Hollywood bubble of these guys just like pushing themselves harder and harder and pushing the studio's pocketbooks to the absolute breaking point. Um, and that was kind of like the last one of those that worked. Like,
Mm,
next up you have like Sorcerer, Heaven's Gate, One from the Heart from Coppola again. New York, New York is the same year as Sorcerer. It's just like
mm.
the wheels kind of fall off the wagon after Apocalypse Now. It's one of like Raging Bull is 1980. Just everything kind of falls apart at that point. Um, but Apocalypse Now does kind of feel like if aliens uncovered that film, they would be like, "Oh, this is like a testament of a
Yeah,
civilization in absolute disarray or whatever." And it kind
totally.
of it does speak to not only that moment in cinematic history, but also uh it speaks to something of the human condition, and of course, it
Mm,
has some historical fiction aspects. It also is tied into a work of literature. It has touches of Homer. It is one of those movies that you're like, yeah, you could definitely do a whole lot worse if you had to come up with like, explain to me what a movie is in one movie. It's Apocalypse Now.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. But I need to have a think. But yeah, number four, my slot is empty. What would your four be?
I mean, I'm very active on Letterboxd. You can follow me at Crematoria if you want to. And I only have 3 on my top 4, much to some of my friends' consternation. Um, I have one friend specifically, I won't put him on blast, who he will text me like every 3 months. He will Photoshop a 4th movie into my profile page and be like, "God, I didn't realize that you love Transformers 3 so much," or what. Like he'll it's just some stupid inside joke, but apparently it really bothers him that I only have 3 in my top 4. Um, but yeah, my top 3 on Letterboxd, of course, are, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, which is kind of the chalk bet for my favorite movie of all time, if
Yeah.
someone, gun to my head or whatever. Um, don't know why they would feel so strongly about this. We gotta know your
Tell me
favorite
your
movie.
favorite movie of all time. You know what's funny?
Punch your
Okay,
favorite
quick
movie into the
anecdote.
computer.
Quick note. So you know how you say, gun to my head, I'd say this sort of thing. I was at a conference in
This is what
Italy
yeah,
years
you
ago.
told me about this, and that they freaked
Yeah.
out because they're
Yeah.
not
Like
American and they're not used
just
to
how
casual
aggressive
gun violence,
that
yeah.
of a phrase, yeah, because like we just use it at casual gun violence, and they were like, "Why do you use that's such an aggressive term?" And I'm like, I just didn't think that because we were talking about
Yeah.
like if geniuses exist, and I was like, "Ah, man, if you had to put a gun to my head, I'd say da da da," da," and they were like, "Oh my," they were like so offended.
What's so funny is that as I was about to say it, I was thinking of when we had that conversation because I think we talked about it on Cinemythology, that you
Mm.
mentioned this story, but I don't know what the hell movie we were talking about. Um, but
Willy
yeah,
Wonka and the
you had
Chocolate
told me that
Factory.
no, because we did that on Show Me the Meaning. That was
Oh,
one of the
okay.
last episodes we did before Wisecrack pulled the plug. So maybe we'll cover one of your favorite movies a few months from now when they're about to pull the plug again.
So tell your
um,
friends and subscribe and hit that bell so you get the
and
notifications. Listen on your
and on that
podcast.
note, we have an email address for the show set up, so you can send in fan mail or hate mail. We don't discriminate. You can send any emails you want to wisecrack.smtm@gmail.com, and we will dip into the mailbag for future episodes. We're trying to, once again, kind of find our footing a little bit in these first few months this year. And as we roll over into 2025, we're going to be playing with different formats and things like that. Maybe doing a mailbag section at the end of certain episodes, or maybe just doing a mailbag episode altogether every once in a while. That could be a fun way for us to break things up a bit. Um, excuse me. But speaking of different formats, today we're bringing you another cage match. It's fall. The holidays are upon us. The whole fucking enterprise feels so hollow. Like everything fucking sucks. Like everything
Well,
sucks right now. And we're like, anyway, let's talk about
but
these,
that's what's
these
so
fun,
amazing.
fun little movies.
I was trying to describe like the subgenre of Reagan's America films to my
Hmm.
Australian wife. And I was like, so there is like in hindsight, there is definitely a way to look at films that came out during this time period as bearing these hallmarks of like a
Not,
prosperous nation at the end of history because
yeah, not
there's
even
clearly
really in
things.
hindsight.
Yeah, because even
Necessary
at the
when you read
time, yeah.
yeah, when you read about how, like, Sylvester Stallone had multiple conversations with Ronald Reagan about the Rambo sequels, I think First Blood Part 2, he told Ronald Reagan, like, "We're gonna win this time." That whole movie is just like, well, how the Vietnam War might have gone differently if one John Rambo had shown up.
Yeah.
All the Rocky sequels are very much the same. Every single Rocky sequel is just reiterating American exceptionalism. Um, but yeah, certainly, you know, what's funny is that I watched Planes, Trains, and Automobiles with my girlfriend Brenda, and she was like, "This guy's fucking awful." Talking about Steve Martin, she's like, "This guy sucks." And even if he didn't suck, she said something to the effect of, "It would still be difficult to get invested in this because what's at stake is just like, oh, he's not gonna make it home for Thanksgiving, boo hoo." And I told her, like, Brenda, you don't understand. This is an upper
That's
middle class white man in America at the end of the 80s. Not making
that's
it
right.
home for Thanksgiving dinner is the worst fucking thing that could possibly ever happen to him.
That's it.
And I think there is an element of that that is like, you know, obviously we'll get into it. For obvious reasons, The Breakfast Club is maybe a little bit more universal. It's one of those movies that I think everyone talks about this, that it kind of, more than capturing an era, it kind of captures a spirit, you know, the feeling of being young and rebellious or confused or in love or all of the above and misunderstood and blah blah blah. And I think it does, you know, at least for a certain subset, like read white American kids, suburban kids, certainly. Um, but there's still something with the archetypes of that film. There is still something that is a bit more universal and relatable than like when you're watching Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And it really does feel much more tied to that specific moment in a way that Breakfast Club is. Yeah, maybe it's not that it's not that they either one has aged terribly, but Breakfast Club has aged better just in how, like, I think it's still probably more accessible to kids
Mm,
who are the age of those characters as opposed to like people who are the age of Steve Martin and John Candy in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. So much of what they're experiencing is like a very kind of corporatized, like, it's, you know, this is a guy whose real problem at the end of the day stems from the fact that like he lives in Chicago but works in New York. And like, I don't know how many people there are now or even then who had that kind of job of like, they're kind of jet setting around and selling ads and they're used to first class treatment and blah blah blah. um Obviously that's part of the movie. He's very very pampered and has to learn to be, you know, 10% more patient with people over the course of the film. But I did think it was funny that Brenda kind of keyed into that she was just like, God, why can't he just chill? Like, what is the big fucking deal? Like, and
Well,
I also
okay.
think there's part of
Yeah,
us
go ahead.
too that are all like, Thanksgiving sucks. Like, I don't want to see my family. I don't want to travel. Like, what's the
I'm
there's
vegetarian. I don't really care about turkey.
yeah, there's a comedian, I can't remember who it was. He has this song that's just called "I'm Not Paying $500 to Watch Douchebags Eat Turkey." Um, and I think there is, you know, or there are perhaps multiple generations at this point for whom that is basically the Thanksgiving experience of like, no, why the fuck would I go through the trouble and the investment of going home for something that is just going to be a terrible experience?
Hmm. It's interesting. I think like in very sort of simple kind of jokey but also serious sense, like the takeaways for me of like the themes, if there is a general meaning of these two films. Like Breakfast Club is pretty simple, right? It's like behind all
Yeah,
of our
for sure.
differences, there are similarities that, extend beyond the kind of like simple little archetypes that we fit, like the jock, the burnout, et cetera, right? Like that's pretty simple and universal to identify. Still a lot to chew on. I think it's really interesting, but the one that like really rings in my head for Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is that wife guys, they're like hardcore wife guys. Like absolute, like that is the thing that drives them. Like they are just wife guys. And you don't really see a lot of stories about wife guys anymore. And that's, that this film is about wife guys and smoking indoors. And that is the
Mhm.
two things that like I kept watching this and it was like John Candy loves his wife so much, and or his ex-wife, I guess, so much. and Steve
That's
Martin
what
loves.
happens. That's what happens when your wife dies, is they become your
Yeah.
ex-wife.
Yeah, sorry, his
When you yeah,
widow? His
when you get married to your girlfriend, she becomes your ex-girlfriend.
That's right. That's right. Yeah,
Okay,
sorry. I made ex-wife make it seem like he dumped her for, like, a younger version. No, that is not what happened. He's a wife guy.
sure.
Committed to being a wife guy, and Steve
Yeah,
Martin is a
he's a
wife guy
widower.
and a family guy. He's a family guy. He's a wife guy and a family guy, and anything that prevents them from being wife guys, that's where the drama is, and they can bond. Their bond is ultimately about overcoming the obstacles because they're both wife guys. That's that's just not a story that you hear about in 2024 too much. And
Um,
smoking indoors.
in smoking indoors, that's something that, I watch every time I watch one of these. This is something that has become a bit of a refrain for me. I don't know why, just because I think we've whatever, however many movies we've covered that are kind of looking back or whatever. I'm not a nostalgic person just by nature. But there is like a there's a melancholy that I get from like I think a lot of these movies especially are going to start to curdle, especially like fall and winter movies now. We were just talking about this before we got on the mic that in February I'm going to be in Minnesota shooting a movie and the movie requires snow, right? And we were supposed to be shooting it this past February and there was no snow in Minnesota. And that's really fucking scary. Um and obviously like it's scary for reasons that are much more important than, I didn't get to make a movie, oh woe is me. But it's something that does like it makes me feel really fucking depressed when I watch a fall and winter movie that has really great atmosphere and all these beautiful exteriors taking advantage of the weather and the region and all that. And I just sit there and watch it now and I just think to myself like, I was reading this study about how like scientists are talking about like, yeah, in addition to like all the terrible stuff that will come with the accelerating climate crisis, there's also just little things that you take for granted of like you're not going to see fall colors anymore and you're not going to have like a white Christmas anymore and just stuff like that where,
Mhm.
I remember thinking the same thing about COVID of just like there's just an insult that's added to the injury that like we were all worried about getting sick during COVID, and then on top of that like dealing with that anxiety and trauma to some extent. The insult that was added to that injury was that we couldn't be together to experience it together.
Mhm.
Just little things like that that you do take for granted how much time you spend with the people you love. And I think like to rescue this from becoming our third bummer episode in a row, but I think in some ways like for different reasons there's still a universality to that. Like that is whether, and I'm curious your thoughts on this going into something like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. This is a movie about someone who is held up on a flight, on a train, and then in a car. Oh, that's where they got the title.
The bus
Um,
first,
in a
automobiles,
bus, yeah,
plural.
right. And there is that added context of like, if this were any other fucking week, like it would just be an annoyance. But because it's Thanksgiving, it's the end of the world. It's this kind of tragedy. And I'm kind of curious in your mind, what is that? Like why is that so much more injurious than if this had just been some like, and obviously I have notions of it. I think you bring up the Reagan stuff. It's worth recognizing that like Thanksgiving as a holiday, not nearly as marketed as something like Christmas and stuff like that. But still, there's an expectation. There's a societal kind of superstructure that
Yeah.
reinforces the notion that No, like, there's a reason once a year we all eat dinner at 2:30 and act like that's fucking normal. Like, it's special, it's
Yeah.
this whole big fucking deal, but, like, why? And I know that's a stupid question, but I feel like you'll have a smart answer for it.
So there's an interesting idea that I think we could look at this an interesting angle based on some ideas that I think we can look at this from. So in the work of like Felix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze, French post-phenomenological continental thinkers, they write about how the nuclear family, how it oftentimes is positioned within capitalist society to act as a mini state. And what they mean by that is that the bureaucracy, the hierarchy, the divisions, the despotism that you get in a state structure is like microcosmed by the family. And they analyze this through kind of like Freudian, post Freudian idea of it's like a mommy, daddy, me nexus, is what they call it. But nevertheless, the crucial point here is that there's something about capitalist society that is based on state structure, and especially 20th and 21st century capitalist state societies, fully formed, fully fledged capitalist societies. And the family operates as a kind of way to reinforce the larger societal superstructural state mechanisms. And so there is something about Reagan's America, with all of, like, the BS about deregulation. Actually, I think the language of deregulation is something that's thrown into a lot of scrutiny in certain critical theory fields and social theory fields, because while we may have experienced a lot of deregulation in one sense, what you get is a lot of re-regulation in favor of the market. So, like, state mechanisms that were meant to stay the hand of the market's free movement may have been removed, but in exchange for the relitigation and institution of new institutional legislation that buttress elements of the market to create new credit mechanisms and then to protect the instruments that are then created from within those new credit mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not a fan of using the language of deregulation to characterize the kind of neoliberal shift or the kind of like shift under Reagan and Thatcher, et cetera. But what's interesting to note is that what doesn't go away is the power of the state. And the state is just sort of like repositioned. And I think that the family, the nuclear family, has priority in that new repositioning. And so the idea then of the importance of the family gathering takes on a whole new meaning when you start to think about, well, not only are both Steve Martin and John Candy's characters businessmen in the sense that they are hustling, one to better success than the other. And you kind of see John Candy at one point even literally hustling in a sort of like nefarious sense, like
Yeah,
selling the shower curtains as as earrings and stuff like that. So there's a
earrings,
sense
yeah.
in which they're also, not exactly the most ethical maybe people, although you don't see that with Steve Martin in business, but you see that with him in his interactions with people outside of the business sphere, that he's not exactly the most ethical character, and so you kind of presume then that
Well,
he doesn't have great moral fiber.
I'm also curious if you wanna go down this tangent of, like, what's the difference between being is he unethical or is he just an asshole?
Mm,
Like, because to me, unethical implies some kind of underhandedness, and maybe I'm forgetting some stuff in the movie that but Steve Martin
you're
is
right.
kind of
No, he has a
like, throughout
code.
the film, he's just a
Yeah,
dick. Like,
he is a
but
dick. Yeah,
he's, uh, what do they say? There's a difference between being frank and being dick. Like,
yeah.
he's not. That's his problem is that he isn't mincing words. He's being very aggressive and forward. But that I think is an interesting thread to pull. And I'm curious. You're probably someone who's put a lot more thought into something like that than I have in my life because I just maybe it's just it's pedantry, but I'm curious in your mind, like what is the difference between being ethical and just being rude
Yeah, no, I guess,
or
if you're really
unethical
gonna,
and
like
being rude? Like
yeah,
I think
if you're
there's
really
a Venn diagram, maybe.
There totally is, and that's what I was gonna say is like, obviously, if you're gonna split hairs, there probably is a difference between, being moral, and being ethical, and he does seem to have some sort of, like, code, right? Because he's like, "You stole from me at one point," and he does and then he's like, "I'm just gonna pay for something, don't worry about it, you don't have to pay me back." So there's, like, some sort of, like, moral fiber that he has, but I guess if you take ethics as being like how to construct the good society, probably like cussing out someone who's a customer service representative
Yeah,
isn't a part of an ethical good society. So in that
of
sense,
course.
I would say his ethics are probably a little bit marred. But he doesn't do anything like John Candy does, where John Candy, who's the good guy of the two, who actually does like rip people off by lying to them and selling them, plastic shower curtain rings and says that they're earrings and that they're like coated ivory or whatever else he
I
says.
mean, the thing is though, is that selling someone a shower ring and telling them it's an earring, like if they stick it in their ear, it's an earring.
No,
I
but he
mean,
says that they're
like,
like it's
hold
like
on, but
plated
they like
ivory and
that's what I'm getting to is that
okay, okay.
he says that they're like valuable. He says
Antiques
like
and
yeah, but then he's selling them for $5 a pop. Like there there's that kind of tension a little bit of like, what they
yeah.
say of like the greatest con is one that makes the mark feel like they're in on it. And for him, like there's maybe a little bit of that. Like there is a
Like
weird kind of
they know
integrity
that it's
to it.
not really an antique and they're
Yeah,
like,
where
"Yeah,
it's like,
whatever, but it's 5
"Oh
bucks."
yeah,
Yeah.
this is, platinum ivory or whatever the hell he says. I'll give it to you for $5." He's like, "Sure you will." Like
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
at the
yeah,
end
yeah.
of the day, it's still one of those things that is kind of interesting about these two characters is that Steve Martin is a dick in all the ways that John Candy, like they could not be further away from each other on that spectrum. Like John Candy's incredibly charming and affable, and very personable. Steve Martin very prickly and downright just an asshole throughout most of the film. But then when we see them plying their trades, the roles are kind of reversed. That Steve Martin always kind of wants to settle up. We never see him running a hustle on people or anything like that. But it's like maybe we're digging for tin on this episode because we really
Yeah.
just wanted to
Well,
cover some fun stuff. But it's a kind of a fun little dichotomy there.
no, it is, and I was gonna say real quick, actually, I just realized that we're, like, 20 minutes into the discussion, and many people may not have seen Planes, Trains, and Automobiles or The Breakfast Club. Should we give, like, a little synopsis of what the fuck happens in these movies?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is about a disgruntled corporate advertising
It's like
executive.
marketing something, yeah.
Yeah, played by Steve Martin. He's trying to make it home for Thanksgiving dinner, uh, and he bumps into John Candy quite literally, tripping over his luggage, trying to catch a taxi, and they're both headed toward Chicago from New York. But over the course of the film, every attempt that they make to get there, either by plane, by train, or by automobile, is stymied in some frustrating and hilarious ways. It's a very funny movie. This is like a cable classic. It was on TV every year around this time of year, and it's one of those films that like I'm sure if you're listening to this, even if you haven't seen it, you probably have some familiarity with it because there are a lot of scenes that were, always chopped up into those like best of comedy things, like John Candy tributes, John Hughes tributes, certainly a very influential filmmaker who directed both of these movies. And then The Breakfast Club is a movie about five kids from disparate backgrounds who spend a Saturday together in detention, and over the course of the film, find out that they're not so different after all. Um, you know, I could say more about the movie, but that's basically it. Both of these films, and as is kind of John Hughes' approach a lot of the time, they're very simple. They have kind of straightforward premise of like I've got to get from A to B. Or in the case of Breakfast Club, I've got to get through a long, boring day surrounded by strangers. Um, he also wrote Home Alone. Very simple. Kid
But
gets left home alone over Christmas
you can
break.
see a lot of the beats of Home Alone in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. There's
Sure.
a similar momentum,
Certainly,
energy.
if you watch Uncle Buck, which I did last
Uncle
night
Buck
since
is
I was on
great.
a little bit of a John
Oh,
Hughes
cool.
kick, Macaulay Culkin is in that. It was a couple years before Home Alone, and there are scenes of it that feel like proto Home Alone bits where
Mm.
like John Candy calls his sort of off again girlfriend to go and check on the kids while he's trying to hunt down one of the other kids, and Macaulay Culkin is sitting by the mail flap when she rings the doorbell, and he like flips up the mail flap because he's really nervous, and he's making her do all this stuff like show me your ID so I know it's you. Okay, now take your ID out and put it through the mail flap. There are
Oh,
little beats
yeah.
like that that very
That could be
clearly
Home
feel
Alone.
like the sort of precocious Kevin McAllister. He's he's very much in control, but also scared out of his wits. And of course, Macaulay Culkin's great in Home Alone. He kind of strikes that tension really well. Um, but yeah, John Hughes. I think this is one of those things that kind of can't be overstated. How incredibly influential he was in the '80s. And of course, like going into the '90s. But when you think of John Hughes' directorial efforts, it's really the '80s. 16 Candles, Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, another one of your favorites. Um, Uncle Buck, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. He only directed 8 movies, but like 4 or 5 of them have stuck around as like anywhere between perennial holiday favorites, like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, or like kind of generation defining movies like your Breakfast Clubs and your 16 Candles. Um
And then he wrote
and
a bunch of other like, he wrote Pretty
he
in
wrote
Pink,
yeah, he
right?
wrote
And he
National
wrote
Lampoon's
National
Vacation.
Vacation.
He wrote Pretty in Pink, he wrote Mr. Mom. Like I said, he wrote Home Alone. And there were also tons of movies that kind of came in the wake of John Hughes that, the whole Brat Pack thing, the same year that Breakfast Club came out. There's like an almost quasi sequel called St. Elmo's Fire, where like
Oh,
three of
yeah.
the
Yeah,
Breakfast
yeah,
Club
yeah.
members are graduating college now. Um, and it's just it cannot be overstated how incredibly influential this guy was. Not just the movies he made, but the movies he inspired.
So
Um,
then so then so then let me
oh,
ask you
weird
this then,
Weird
kind of
Science was another one of his that
Weird Science.
was a
Also
huge
Anthony
hit,
Michael
and
Hall.
I
Yeah.
recently rewatched and is like really terrible. Just like a
Oh, is
straight up
it?
terrible. Like it's really really bad. Um it's and not to be this guy, like it hasn't aged well in some respects. Fine, whatever, but it's like a raunchy teenage comedy. I don't think it's supposed to age well personally,
Yeah.
but that is not why I dislike. I dislike it cuz it's just fucking stupid as shit and boring as hell. Um
Mm.
but I like I do find something appealing about these movies of like, and we can get into this. I'm curious, do you have any? I know how much you love Ferris Bueller. We've talked about that on Show Me the Meaning Volume 1 back in the day. But do you have any connection to either one of these movies? I'm curious.
Well, Breakfast Club, is one of the ones that like, I mean, I hadn't seen it since I was a kid,
People of a
but
certain age.
yeah, and I'm literally since I was like a teenager or preteen, I haven't seen it since then. But, I've seen scenes 1,000 times. I feel like I know the whole movie even without having to see it. It's just one of those ones that
Sure.
stays with you and is so reproduced everywhere that it's kind of fresh. And then, like you say, the themes are so universal as well that it's kind of, I think if you just talk about the basic themes of this film, every single person who has gone through high school would be like, yeah, I get it to some extent, right? Um, and Trains, Planes, and Automobiles was one of my stepdad's favorite movies. So we had a
Okay.
VHS of it. and, so it was often and it was one of those ones that was on TV, like
Your
on
stepdad's a
TBS or
big
some.
wife guy, indoor smoker type.
Absolutely. But yeah, and it was like on TBS all the time and so or whatever it was,
Yeah.
probably TNT or TBS or something. And so I'd watch like bits of it. But like in terms of John Hughes stuff, like I just find him so fascinating. I like to think of cinema, especially older cinema, as being this cultural artifact that tells us so much about ourselves and how we view ourselves and the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. I say that all the time, and I think it's so interesting to then like look back at these films and think, so what is it that John Hughes is is sharing, is expressing about, certain types of quintessential American or family experiences, and to kind of like real quick whip it back to the conversation that kind of where we kind of
Yeah.
ellipsed it before we went off to kind of talking about other stuff was, you've got these in planes, trains, and automobiles. You've got these guys who are in the engine room of, American prosperous capitalist economy. One being a traveling salesperson who's maybe a little less prosperous, maybe down on his luck, but is trying to get by, trying to live the American dream. And the other guy who has kind of achieved the American dream. And again, people from different backgrounds, but maybe they're not so different after all. They're both wife guys. But there's something interesting about like what is it that John Hughes mirrors back to us about this time period and about these people and about in particular maybe to kind of like put a button on the whole bit about the nuclear family. What is it about the power of the nuclear family and the Thanksgiving meal that represents something so important to a particular type of American consciousness, and how the practice of doing Thanksgiving and the practice of perpetually living the nuclear family and reproducing the nuclear family, how that does something to Western culture, that does something to American capitalist culture to reproduce it, to move it forward, as daddy goes to work to go make a lot of money so you can have a big home, which is basically kind of what happens in the kind of old school stereotypical nuclear family model. And there's something interesting about that I think that tells us something historically about the country, about the economy, about politics, about society, about gender roles, and that's what I think is so interesting. And it's all done through extremely simple economical storytelling in 90 minutes. And there's clarity, I think, about what he's trying to say, about who his characters are, about what their motivations are. And because of that, I think it's really accessible to watch.
Yeah, there was something that I was thinking about on this watch of Planes, Train because I've seen Breakfast Club tons of times. I'll get into that in a second. Planes, Trains, I've seen all the way through maybe twice, maybe 3 times after the other night or last night. Um, I couldn't help but laugh to myself watching it this time thinking like, of course, all this ad executive wants is to live inside of a Thanksgiving commercial. And, like, that's how it's basically
Yeah.
presented.
Yeah.
Like, there are all these weird montages as they're, trying to make their way across the country and whatever, where it will cut to this idyllic domestic scene in Chicago of his wife, like, carving the turkey and lighting a candle and then, like, staring wistfully out the window and, like, a tear falls down her eye or whatever it is. And I don't know how intentional that is. I haven't read anything to that effect, but, like, watching I have this really bad habit. So, my dad worked in television. Uh, he now runs the local affiliate in my hometown, but growing up, he was, an ad man. He sold commercials and
Mm.
stuff like that, and his dad did the same thing, my grandfather. Um, so when I was growing up, there was a room in our house that was just walls and walls of tapes of like the signal feed from NBC because that's the network that he works for, going back basically to the beginning of NBC.
Mm.
And some of them were TV shows, but the vast majority of them were just like these were ad blocks from this week, this month, this year, and he just had this insane library of old commercials that I would just sit and watch like they were movies.
Wow.
So to this day, one of my more annoying affects is that like I know so many jingles and so many commercials, and I don't think of I'm not like want to show off my jingles or whatever, but like if we're grocery shopping and
You
we
see a
just
box of
walk past.
Cheerios from 1974, you just
Well, no, it's
1974
just like
Cheerios.
there are jingles that people our age don't like. No, I think most people our age don't know that Apple Jacks had a jingle. A is for Apple, J is for Jack, cinnamon toasty Apple Jacks. Like, so when I'm in a fucking grocery store, it's just like someone is pulling my string over and over and over again.
You have been
And
incepted, Raymond, by the marketing
well,
industry.
so it's one of those things where like obviously I don't watch TV today, like I've never really been much of a TV guy, but I have a bad habit of like if I'm having friends over to watch horror movies around Halloween, I'll put on you can go to YouTube and just type in old Halloween commercials and it'll play a bunch of old Halloween commercials from the 80s or 90s or whatever. And I do the same thing around Thanksgiving. I do the same like these are like comfort viewing for me. They're just,
Mm.
and it's not lost on me that yeah, that like you said, I've been incepted by the marketplace, but also like because of my weird fucking dumbass brain, like I was so acculturated to this stuff that and I also like I feel like I had a backstage pass to how ads work and like why they work and how they're designed. And I remember like literally I can think of times that I was sitting eating lunch with my dad and him explaining to me like, "Oh, we don't sell a product, we sell an idea. We sell like just little things like that where the psychology of advertising was deeply ingrained along with the adverts themselves. So much so that now I don't like I'm not saying like, "Oh, I'm immune or inoculated to advertising or whatever." But it's one of those things where like I'm not I I don't think of myself as a terribly materialistic person. Like I have a lot of books and I have a lot of Blu-rays, but that's kind of it. Like, and I feel like those are more expressions of my interests than they are. Like you don't turn on TV and see a bunch of ads for Blu-rays, right, or ads for books these
Or
days.
books.
So all that to say, watching planes, trains, and automobiles, and once again, maybe it's just because my brain is broken in a very specific way. Watching the movie this time around, I'm just like, "Oh, he deleted TV." Like, he's sick of having to deal with all these people who give, like, friction to his life, and, like, he just wants to be the hero of his own story. He just wants to go back to being the protagonist of his own life, and he just cannot deal with the fact that someone else is holding the remote for this, 90-minute span of this movie. And I think there's something fun to that, you know?
Yeah. Do you think that the film is sort of like a battle over whose story it is? Is that like an essential way? Is that the central driving dramatic effect? Is it's a guy who just wants to continue to maintain control over the remote, the clicker, and this guy stole the clicker out of his hand, literally in the sense of stealing his taxi, and that he just can't get the fucking clicker back, and he just keeps fucking trying, but the guy keeps showing up and is like, "I got the clicker right here. I
Yeah,
got the clicker right here."
whose story is it? I mean, it's always from Steve Martin's perspective that every decision that John Candy makes is not like he is very rarely moving the story forward. He's often moving the story backward in certain ways, or just little things like one of the gags that my dad loves from this movie is the bit where Steve Martin gets out of the shower and all the towels are gone except for like a hand towel and he has to dry off
Yeah,
with that. I remember that being a thing where like on vacation, if we were staying in a hotel or whatever and there weren't enough towels, he would always go like classic planes, trains, and automobile. Like it was like part of our own family lexicon was that like we're all gonna be drying off with little hand towels. Um but I think the movie never really puts you in a position to feel like, God, I hope John Candy gets him across the finish line with this one, even though, like, every once in a while, when he's running that hustle, selling the shower rings to make a few bucks so they can buy a burger. Um, he's always treated as the obstacle, even though he is like
Mm.
obviously a very lovely person, if a little bit boorish or inept or stupid or what, like, I don't know what the nice way to describe Del Griffiths is or whatever his name is. Um, but I think the movie is always very much Steve Martin's story, and that's
Mm.
why Steve Martin's so pissed off. Like that he's doing he's kind of doing everything right. Like tries to get to the airport, you know, his boss keeps him there over time. And they actually do make it onto the plane, but they have to reroute because Chicago O'Hare is snowed under.
I've been
Then,
there,
like, they
literally. I've been snowed in at at O'Hare.
well, this was something that John Hughes said he was, like, going the opposite way. He was going from Chicago to New York, and because of inclement weather, they landed in Wichita, which is where they land in the movie. And I think this movie is the reason it's so frustrating is that, like, there's really not anything Steve Martin could have done better at any juncture, honestly. Like, there are some things, but for the most part, like, macro, like, he does get on a plane
Oh,
home.
yeah.
He
No, it's like
does get on a train home. Like, the
the
universe just
universe is
has to
against
keep
him.
punishing him.
Yeah,
Yeah. And that's the
yeah.
thing that's so uniquely frustrating about it is that the boulder just keeps on rolling back down the hill, even when you're like, I didn't know there was a boulder and I didn't know there was a hill.
And sometimes Del Griffiths, John Candy's character, does make things worse, like when he throws the cigarette in the back of the car and the car catches on fire, and he, like,
Yeah.
exacerbates the problems. But, like their money getting stolen, that I mean, I guess you could say that's John Candy's fault because he booked the hotel room, so it's like a sleazy hotel room, and so, like, he took maybe, but that's, like, really stretching it. He doesn't ever do anything intentionally to sabotage, and there's only, like, 1 or maybe there's a couple times where he actually does something directly to slow down Steve Martin's journey home. He's trying
That's
to help most of
also
the time.
that's also one of those blasts from the past of carrying around hundreds of dollars in cash in your
It
wallet.
was yeah,
Or-
yeah.
Like if I find $5 in my wallet, I'm like, wow, eureka! Like,
My wife
it
saying my
is
wife
so weird to carry cash.
and not having a cell phone, like, my wife kept saying, she's like, "If I just didn't hear from you for a couple of days because you were out on the road," she's like, "I would think you left me." You know? It's like whereas this wife is just dutifully trusting, that her husband is, like
Waiting by the window like a Labrador.
yeah, she's a
Yeah.
little annoyed, a couple of times, like, "Why are you in Wichita?" But, she just trusts that he's a wife guy, and he's going to be there, and he's going to do his damnedest to get there. And, it's okay that they don't have constant communication, and it's okay that he disappears for days on end or whatever.
Yeah, one of those classic movies that's like just you really can't make it today just because cell phones and GPS and all the
And
above
Ubers.
would render the plot completely
Yeah,
moot.
and digital payment systems, like, everyone's card is on their phones
Yeah.
now, and that's why,
Everything is so
After
frictionless
Hours,
now.
the Scorsese film After Hours is another one that we talk about that's
Well,
like well, but I mean,
oh,
just the central conceit,
going on
like
after hours because here's the thing about after hours is it doesn't make any fucking sense in the 80s either. Just aim your face toward your apartment and walk. Like it's New
it's
York.
New York,
Like
it's a grid city.
you
Yeah, yeah.
it's great. What's the John Mulaney
Just
bit? Like it's two over and up there. Like,
yeah.
um, that's the thing that's so frustrating about. And I know it's a farce, whatever. But After Hours is such a frustrating movie. I'm so annoyed by that movie because I'm just like, shut the fuck up and walk to your apartment. You are in New York. You can walk from the top of that city to the bottom of it in in a manner of hours. Quit bitching and just walk to your apartment. I'm so sick of watching it. It's like that to me is like the difference between that and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is that, like, no, legitimately, Steve Martin and John Candy do keep getting stopped from getting home, whereas Griffin Dunn just refuses to walk. He refuses to, and it's not even that far.
It's an allegory about limbo and about, the in-between spaces. It's a liminal story
Ugh,
and,
whatever,
there's like that
whatever.
religious, yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's yeah, that was the thing about Planes, Trains, and Automobiles when I was watching it that I was thinking about. Did you ever watch, The Good Place, that TV show?
Oh, yeah.
It
Yeah,
feels
yeah,
like
yeah.
it was designed for you. Um, there's a bit in that where, I guess, whatever, spoiler alert for The Good Place,
Spoiler.
where they find out they're actually in the bad place. They thought they were in heaven, they're actually in hell. And I remember, I was about halfway through the first season, and I was texting a friend of mine and being like, "They're in hell, right?" And he's like, "How did you figure that out?" I was like, "Well, because hell is other people. Like, it's just playing
Mm,
on that." And
mm.
I think this Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is that. It's just the entire
Oh,
movie is like, this is Steve Martin's personal hell, is that he's surrounded by people whom he regards as not only dumber and lesser than him, but
mm,
also essentially inhuman, that every person he encounters is seen as an obstacle or an object rather than a subject of their own life or a protagonist of their own story or whatever.
mm.
And I think this movie is essentially about him learning that he actually shares the world, he doesn't run it. um and it is
And
like,
he can be charitable to those that are lesser than him because he can bring them home to a good upper middle class meal.
yeah. Yeah. He has the benefit at the end. And also the fact that, like, even when things go wrong for him, he's a person who is very obviously used to just buying his way out of problems. Of like,
Yeah,
I can slide the card, I can pay, like, he forks over 75 bucks for a taxi he doesn't even get to take. Like, this is someone for whom an annoyance has a an annoyance, a frustration, or a setback will always have some kind of price tag, and usually
yeah.
he can satisfy it. Um, and I think there is something kind of lovely to how completely humbled he is over the course of the film. Um, to the point where at the end, like, it's a Christmas Carol, or it's Grinch. His heart grows three sizes,
Yeah.
and he realizes that, like, what does Lloyd Christmas say? That, like, old people, while being inconvenient and blah blah blah, do serve some purpose or whatever. And, like, that's Steve Martin in this movie of just like, yeah, I guess
Yeah.
there are other people in the world and I shouldn't be a fucking asshole to them all the time, because sometimes I may need them. And even if that's the extent to which he's grown, is like, he sees other people as other people, even if it's just because he may need a transaction once in a while. Like, I guess it's still a step in the right direction.
I think we should probably start talking about Breakfast Club now because we got about a half hour left. And I just thought too, are we supposed to be running a fucking poll for the audience to
We're
vote too?
I think for no, for these polls, we always do them on social media after, so people will have
Okay.
like 24 hours to vote.
Okay.
Well, we are
Okay. So
running a
And
there's.
poll,
Oh,
and
we're
we
right
are
running a
running a
now,
poll
poll then.
on.
planes, trains,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
automobiles is winning at 59%.
Well, we haven't talked
Wow.
about Breakfast Club yet, so
True.
We
let's
haven't
see
talked
what
about
True.
Breakfast
happens.
Club yet.
Yeah. Thank you for that,
Okay,
man.
here we
Okay.
go, everybody.
So
So, okay.
Breakfast Club.
So, here's my spiel on Breakfast Club, what the movie means to me. Not gonna make a big bummer out of this, but I had a very close friend, one of my best friends in high school. This was her favorite movie of all time. Tragically, we lost her about 4 years ago. And this is a movie that, uh, every time I watch it, not to sound too, you know, sappy about this, I can still hear Elise sitting next to me, kind of saying the lines along with the movie. And I have never been a huge fan of Breakfast Club. I like it. I think it's fun. It's a cozy watch. Um, but I was a big fan of Elise. right? She was one of my best friends, and we watched this probably at least once or twice a year throughout high school. And I recently had a little bit of a, you know, not a meltdown necessarily. I had a bit of a bum out maybe a year ago. I was kind of in my feelings. I was thinking about my friend whom we lost, and I could not find my copy of The Breakfast Club anywhere. And it was just one of those things. I wanted to put it on. I wanted to feel a closeness to her. And I had like a John Hughes 3 pack, and I had the other two movies, and I could not find The Breakfast Club in it. Um, so I got the Criterion edition on Blu-ray, which is a great edition if you're a fan of this movie. Even if you've seen it 100 times, I would still recommend, maybe as a stocking stuffer this year, get yourself a copy of The Breakfast Club on Blu-ray from Criterion because it is chock full. There's like an hour-long documentary, tons of behind-the-scenes footage, old interviews with the cast. There's one um there's one special feature that's kind of weird but a little bit lovely where Judd Nelson reads John Hughes's notes over like a montage of footage from the movie.
Mm.
Um uh and then there's also, oh, what was I going to say? Oh, there's like an hour of deleted scenes because John Hughes was notorious for just the camera rolling. Like there are a lot of folks, if you read, there's a book about John Hughes and the Brat Pack and the whole like sort of teen movie kind of subgenre that he helped kickstart. That's called You Couldn't Ignore Me If You Tried. It's a really, really fun kind of quick read if you're into these movies. Highly recommend it. And they talk in that about like how actors got so used to like they wouldn't hear the word cut. Eventually they would just hear the film flipping around inside the magazine when it had run
Uh,
out, because he would just keep the camera rolling for an entire magazine and let these kids improvise and just like share their lives with each other. And um yeah, it's a movie that, like I said, I'm not a huge fan of it. It's not one that I feel is like a defining movie for me in the way that it is for a lot of folks our age. But because it meant so much to Elise, it still is like
mm,
it has that place in my heart where it's like maybe my I don't want to say my least favorite because I do enjoy it, but out of all the movies that I regularly rewatch, I probably like it the least.
mm,
Um and once again, that's not to say I dislike it. There are just certain aspects of it that are like, it's a little rickety at times. There are some aspects of it. I think we need a different phrase than it's aged poorly because that always implies that it's like offensive or whatever. And
problematic.
certainly there's
Yeah.
some stuff in this movie that is, maybe a little bit problematic, but most of it's being said by a problematic character. Um but there are some aspects of the film similar to Weird Science where I'm like, "Oh, this is just aged poorly in that like it's not all that funny and it doesn't like have the same impact on me that it would have had on an audience then." But also like this is the Pulp Fiction thing of or the Easy Rider thing for me where I'm just like, yeah, some movies you maybe just had to be there. I don't necessarily think Breakfast Club is one of those movies, but I can see how this is a film that if you went to it in 85 when it came out and you had never seen a movie that really like tackled the high school experience head on, other than, maybe 16 Candles, which had come out before this, um but really dealt with the feelings of teenagers in a way that was like not sneering or mocking or
Mm.
ironic or distanced in any way, that was like really like, yeah, let's fucking get in the shit and like meet these kids where they live and take their problems seriously, even though maybe you watch it now and some of the stuff that they're saying maybe feels a little bit trite.
Yeah. Yeah. I did wonder that. It's like they couldn't make this movie today, not just because of some of the kind of like outdated, more sort of uncouth elements, but also like kids are heavier today. The weight that like I say this as somebody who has been an educator at the tertiary level since 2009, 2010. So I've dealt with 17 onwards upwards, students, and even since 2010, like there's a weight that teenagers carry now that was not as present in previous generations. Part of it is obviously the pressures that come from social media. A lot of it comes and of course with that are like the expectations to conform more heavily, and I think that creates more of a pressure, but also greater consciousness of what's going on in the world. Like people, they aren't as naive maybe, so like the high school experience that this film really captures is really buttressed and supported by a type of naivete, which this is then goes back to that whole Reagan America thing. It's like, yes, these kids all have legitimate shit that they're going through, right? Like, Bender's father is abusive to him and his mother. Um, Brian obviously is suicidal at one point, right? Ali Sheedy, my wife kept saying this. It's so funny. Ali she's in a different movie, like from everybody else. Like for the
She's so
first
good in this.
the first half, like she's in a different movie from everybody else, and then
Yeah.
she comes in,
Every
but
time I
she's
watch this movie, I'm more convinced she's the best performance in it.
like
Um, the and just like the little stuff of like when Bender plugs the knife into the chair, and then you just
she
kind of
just
like
takes
see
it.
her enter the frame and pluck it,
Yeah.
like
See, I
little
I
stuff
thought that
like
this
that.
movie was hilarious. I was cracking up. Also, at just how like fucking weird it was, like her squeaks every once in a while. But I thought it was. I thought Anthony Michael Hall, Brian, that character. I think he's so funny. He is so
Mhm.
funny, and so
So
natural.
I can cook.
Like there's no pushing or forcing in that performance at all, you know? And so like all of these teens, they all have their own shit. You've got like the
Yeah.
rich girl with Molly Ringwald's character and kind of like the shit that she has to deal with, which at one point it was funny. Sean did turn to me and she's like, "Oh, boo-hoo, I'm so popular, everyone likes me," kind of thing. But
Even
but
though
but there
how
is like
much
obviously,
pressure
yeah,
my
it's so
fancy
much
friends
pressure.
put on me to be fancy. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I know that I have to continue to conform to being popular and loved by everybody. But these are like there's a universality to the kind of like standard teen struggles, but it's all supported by like there isn't this existential dread of like climate breakdown, and there
Yeah.
isn't this sense in which they've seen bodies broken apart on Instagram, like our teens
Well,
have
it's
today.
also I mean, the stuff about Brian with a gun in his locker would play a whole lot different
Very different. It
in,
would be that he's a
20
right,
years later.
rather
Yeah,
than
exactly.
exactly. So like even that, like so there's a sense in which there's like a levity that kind of keeps it afloat a little bit, that makes it so that it's very there's a safeness to it. And I think actually to its benefit. I think that's one of the reasons why it has a lot of staying power, because like, can you imagine the Euphoria version of The Breakfast Club? It would be so heavy and so dark, and they would try to make it like super fast and scandalous and all this stuff. Whereas the fact that there's like a lightness here, even though it's like, but teens have serious problems, it comes with like this hook at the end that's kind of like, but the kids are all right. They know how to get through it. They will be okay. And that's that quote, that David Bowie quote at the beginning that starts the film,
Yeah.
and it's
Changes
like they know better about their position than you do. And this film definitely has a little bit of like the kids are smarter than the adults type of thing, and just let them go through their experience and they will be fine.
a little bit. Yeah,
That's
Carl
not the story we tell today. The story we tell today is, "Oh my god, panic button, the kids are not okay."
Carl, the janitor, even tells the, Principal Vernon that
Yeah.
he's just like, y y you used to be like that, you used to have this, that, and the other," and what's the a Simpsons meme that always gets posted online of like maybe maybe I'm wrong and I can't quote it verbatim, but it's Principal Skinner from The Simpsons saying like, "No, it's everybody else that's wrong. I'm right." And
Mm.
he basically like that exact meme is deconstructed in this movie where Carl the janitor is telling him just like, yeah, does it ever occur to you that like maybe just maybe you're kind of underestimating like their interior
Mm.
lives and things like that? And he can't he just cannot fathom it. He can't get his head around that because his entire ego is sort of wrapped up in his sense of authority there. And to him, that sense of authority is just self-justifying. Like I
Totally.
have this job because I deserve this job, and I deserve this job because I have this job.
Mm.
Um, he even tells him like I make $31,000 a year. I'm not
thirty-one
gonna
thousand
throw it
dollars
away
a
for
year.
shit like you.
And I own my own home. Sean
I don't
Sean turned to me
know.
and she goes, How much was $31,000 a year?" So we Googled it. It's about like 96,000. And I'm like, yeah, but even with $96,000 a year, you're probably not able to buy a home in LA. Maybe I don't know about in Chicago, but like you're probably not. Things are very different now.
Yeah, things are very different now. As we've discussed, I think this is a film where have you ever seen School Ties?
Oh yeah, dude.
I love School Ties.
Me too.
Um, if you haven't seen School Ties, it's this movie set in the 50s, I think, where a
Brendan
Jewish
Fraser,
student
Matt
played by
Damon.
Brendan Fraser is recruited by a I don't know what it's like he's recruited by like a college prep school um and the people who
It's high school, isn't it, or is it
it's high
college?
school, but it's like a Harvard
Like a
feeder.
prep
It's like a
academy.
college prep school.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Exactly. It's a preparatory academy. Because he's a really good quarterback. They want him for the football team, but they basically tell him like, "Hey, just don't let anyone know that you're Jewish because these kids, they're different. They're blah blah blah." And when his classmates find out that he's Jewish, despite the fact that he's a good friend and a good student and a good athlete, they all turn on him. And it was one of those movies that, like, I remember my dad, when it was playing on TV one time and he taped it, he was like, "Hey, I taped this movie, School Ties. This weekend, you and I are going to sit down and watch it." Because he wanted to teach me a lesson about like I want to make sure that you understand what this movie's about and how different
Mm,
people are their differences don't make them bad. And like it was just he decided to make a teachable moment out of this movie. So it's one of those movies that even though it's like yeah, it's kind of mediocre and what have you, like it's a movie that once again has a pretty strong place in my heart. There's a bit at the end of the film where one of the teachers finds out that someone in the class has cheated. And this is a
with the
movie that
crib
launched a bunch
sheet,
of careers.
with the
Yeah,
little crib
this
sheet
movie
in the
launched
hand.
launched a
Yeah.
bunch of careers. It's like Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Chris O'Donnell, Anthony Rapp. Like it's a really great cast. All these folks, Brendan Fraser's classmates, and Matt Damon basically turns the rest of the class against Brendan Fraser, even though they know he didn't cheat, but they all just decide they're going to blame him.
Mm,
And there's a scene at the end of the movie where the professor says, like, you guys have to sit in this room and decide how you're going to resolve this. And then you come to us with your decision and let us know who's responsible for this, and we will discipline that person. And as much as I love that movie, there's always been a part of me that's like, "Oh, there's another Breakfast Club right there." Of like
mm.
what's the 90-minute version of that sort of like 12 angry men in a college prep academy where all of these guys have mutual interests but also they're there to like further their own academic careers and eventually like careers. Like there's a high school for future masters of the universe.
Mm.
And I bring it up because it's one of those things that like it plays in some of the same ideas with some of the same milieu as Breakfast Club, and it takes place like 30 years before. And so I do wonder, like, if you jump this thing 30 years ahead, like what does this look like now? And also just the way that, like, culturally, I don't know. The first time I watched this, I was like, what the fuck do you mean they're there on a Saturday? Like, detention for me was after school
After
for
school. Yeah.
an hour or two. Or I also am aware that, like, we had morning detention like 1 day a week. Like, it
I had
was
to go
just
in on
one
the
of those
weekend.
things, yeah.
I had to go in on the weekend once, and
But for like 8 hours?
no, no, not for 8 hours. It was like half a day. It was like 3 hours or something like that. And then just fun fact, they gave us this freezing stuff to basically go around and scrape the gum off the walls because there was just shitloads of gum that people had put on like
Mhm.
chairs, but all around the school. And you would freeze it off, and then you could like flip it off, because like the sticky gum wouldn't come out. And so my friend and I, we
Sure.
stole multiple cans of this freeze stuff, and
So you could
it
huff
was
it.
actually like a great haul. No, you don't get high off it, but it was a great haul because you would just like freeze. So, one of us would be like, taking a piss or something like that, and one of the other guys would run in with the cans and try and spray each other's junk, like dude stuff.
Pretty
Um,
cool.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Pretty good
But
bet.
one of my favorite memories was stealing that. It was very Breakfast Club. Was stealing our. We were total benders, stealing the
Mhm.
freeze cans so that we could have fun with
So
that
is
after
that
our
okay.
detention.
So which one of these 5, I think this is the age-old question of, like, were you a bender, or were the or do in retrospect, or any of these other characters more your speed?
No, so this is the thing because was very much a uh I was very much a Finn from Glee. Was that the character's name?
I
The
don't
one
know.
who's the jock who becomes the Glee guy because I
Despite
my
taking
first 2
place in my
years.
hometown, I've never seen Glee.
Okay, well so it's like, like the main dude character. I think the character's name is Finn. And
Is
he's
that
like
the guy who passed away?
yeah, yeah.
Ah, that's
And
such a bummer.
I know he was so great. Honestly, so great, and just way too
Mhm.
young, way too fucking young. But his character in Glee is that he's like like a top football player, and
Okay.
he is kind of like forced to join the Glee Club, and he realizes because he can sing, and the
Then he
teacher kind
kinda
of like
comes out of
manipulates
his
him from.
shell a little
And then he
bit.
comes out of
Okay.
his shell and he finds his
Okay.
real home and he tries to do sports and that, and it's like the jock people don't accept it, and then there's like a synthesis of it, and then more jock people join the Glee Club because they realize that there's like pretty people there, and they can like find someone that they can be with, and they can have fun and friends and
Okay.
all this other shit. That was me before fucking Glee because I was on the basketball team, but then, my junior year of high school, or wait, was it my second semester of my sophomore year? I basically was behind on arts credits, and my assistant principal or whatever it was like, "You got to take an arts class." And because I grew up in the theater and acting and stuff like that, I was like, "Oh, I'll just take drama because that'll be whatever." And so then, for like the rest of my high school career, I was like a drama kid, but all my friends were still like the jock kids as well, and so it was kind of like both. So I was a little bit of like Brian in nerdiness, but I wasn't a very good student in high school because I didn't really pay
Mm.
attention, even though I had like those kind of like nerdier instincts. But I was also like the Emilio Estevez Andy character because I kind of had the jockiness, but I was definitely not the burnout, the burnout guy. So it was kind of
Mm.
like, yeah, that was kind of my thing. What about you?
I mean, it's tough. If I had to choose one, I would probably say Ali Sheedy. Um, just because, like, I wasn't, like, quiet or bordering on, like, mute or whatever her deal is. Um, but I certainly was I was not like I was not, like, setting things on fire, so Bender's out.
Yeah,
Um, and I think the other thing too that's so difficult for me to relate to with this movie and a lot of other high school movies is that, like, my graduating class was, I think, 90 some people, which isn't terribly small, but is not terribly huge. Like, I knew
oh yeah,
everyone, not just in
oh
my
yeah.
class, but I knew pretty much everyone in my school.
Yeah,
Um,
my graduating class was like 800.
See, exactly, like,
Yeah.
and that was that's the thing that's always funny to me is when they, like, sit down together in this and they're like, don't I know you? What's your name? Do I have a class with
Yeah.
you? I'm like, I
John, she
like
looked at me and
that.
because again, high schools here are much smaller, and she knew everyone in her
Sure.
graduating class, and she was like, "How did they not know each other? Like, I thought they knew each other." And I was like, "Big
Yeah.
high school, I guess, you know?"
Yeah, that's one of those things that I think so much of this movie, and granted, like times change, it's different depending on region, whatever. But I think when you are in a school that is big enough that you can like have class with people whose names you don't know and with whom
Yeah.
you've never exchanged a word, I think in those circumstances, it makes a bit more sense to reduce people to archetypes. I don't I mean, at my school we had friend groups, but we didn't have cliques. It wasn't
Mm,
like jock people here, theater people here, cheerleaders here, or whatever. It was just like all my best friends were like cheerleaders and volleyball players and band kids, and like I just I hung out with people who all had different interests because we all more or less, I won't say that I got along with everybody, but I got along with a lot of people. The other thing about my school was that there were like feeder schools. I was sent to Catholic school my entire life. So I was going to high school with kids that I went to kindergarten with. So it was
oh,
like that was
yeah.
another thing too, was
So
just
you knew
like
him for years. Yeah.
exactly like I spent,
Oh,
over a decade with the same 100 kids. And we all played sports together. We all saw each other at like volunteer events and football games. And like it was just it was weird like that. I
mm,
recognize now, at the time it seemed like, oh, that's just what school is. But anytime I watch a high school movie, I'm like, oh, I realize now that my experience was, I think it was uh Stavros Halkias. I can't I don't know how to pronounce his last name. He's a comedian. Um I just saw a clip of him on a podcast talking about how like he's Greek, and he's like, I think everyone's pretty much the same except white people, but because like wasps basically were the people who made 95% of all popular culture, we're all just convinced that they're the normal ones. But like, if you talk to a Greek person or an Italian person or a Mexican person or anything like anyone from Asian cultures or anything like that, they all say the same stuff of like, oh yeah, family's really important to us, and like we eat a lot, and there were guys in my family who I thought were my uncles but weren't my real uncles, but I just called and
mm.
he's just like, yeah, that's everyone except for wasps.
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
and just because fucking white people had a stranglehold on culture for forever, that just becomes the dominant narrative. So it is one of those things like I do realize now in retrospect that like, oh no, it was of course it was like weird and cloistered that, you know, I
Mm.
had a crush on one girl for 12 years basically. Like it just
Yeah.
just stupid stuff like that. Like you're really,
Yeah.
in addition to being in a closed schooling system, I was also in like not a small town, but it was definitely a small city. Like I think my hometown now is like, I think when I was growing up, maybe 50,000 people, and it's just been tracking downward. I think it's in like mid
Shit.
30,000s now. Like it's a dying town. Um, but it's just stuff like that where you kind of take for granted those things. But I think if I had to choose one, it would probably be Ali Sheedy because, like, I think, yeah, I had my own issues and stuff, and I was a bit of a basket case in some respects, but, like, I was artistic and I was kind of, like, nice and personable, and I got along with a lot of people and, tried to look out for folks. But also the fact that, like, she was just there because she had nothing better to do. I cannot tell you
I
how
love that.
often that was just me. Like, we would have detention in the library, and I was often just in the library. And there was one day a teacher came in and he had seen me in quote unquote detention basically like 4 days in a row, and he goes, "Creamer, what the hell is your problem? Why can you not get your act together?" And he started like legitimately laying into me. He's like, "I'm so embarrassed. Like, aren't you ashamed of yourself? Like, why are you always in detention? This is ridiculous." And then the proctor, the librarian, said like, "Raymond likes to read. Can you please leave him alone? He is not in detention." And I remember I
Oh
remember
my
I'm not
god.
gonna say his name, I won't put him on blast, not like anyone would care, I thought it was pretty funny, um, but he was just immediately like, "Sorry about that, man." Like, slowly backing out. Um, but yeah, probably Ali Sheedy.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think most people's high school experience. I mean, I've lived in multiple different countries, and one of the things that I constantly hear outside of the United States is that, oh man, all we ever wanted was for our high school to be like American high school because that is like the
Well,
dominant.
yeah, I know,
The
like, in London, they have if you are, like, an American expat, they have, like, an American high school that some folks like in the military will put their kids into so that they have like an American high school experience as opposed to
Yeah, and it's
like
the
I know that's not terribly
lockers.
uncommon. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the lockers and the books and the groups with the sports and all the different like clicky things that they're like, "Oh my god, is that really what your high school was like?" And it's the same sort of thing with like college, university. The American university experience is very particular, and like all the way down to the little red solo cups that we use for like beer pong and stuff like that, the party cups. They don't have
Mhm.
them abroad. That's not like a normal thing. So for them, they buy those at specialty stores to have parties where they're like, "Oh, and I got the
American party.
American party cups." And it's like a big feature that they have for their parties. So there is something about like exporting this as like a cultural thing that is so interesting because yeah, there's something very particular about it being the kind of like unique high school American high school experience. But with that said, I think the big qualification is I think that most people don't fit perfectly into one of those archetypes, which is why I think the film
Well, but
actually
that's
works
I
really
mean that's the
well.
point of the movie. Yeah.
That's right, is that nobody does, and that actually, even if you self-identify and this is where I think the film is actually really quite profound in its, like, silliness, is if you over self-identify with, "I am an X," like, maybe you're actually everything, and this is one of the things we talk about in acting class is, like, you are everything. You are good and bad and indifferent, and you have possibilities within you that you can access emotionally that are infinite. And one of the number one blocks for performers, for actors, is that we limit ourselves and we close certain corridors within our hearts off
Mm.
from
Yeah.
allowing them to be expressed and shared with our scene partners. And then what that does is that limits your capacity for connection and presence, and then therefore vulnerability and expression, which is what arises in what we call performance, right? And so I think there's this something so beautiful about that Walt Whitman idea that that I contain multitudes, that we are all everything, and that if you are so like so if you clamor so tightly to holding on to that self identity, you're really cutting yourself off and you're limiting yourself from the possibilities that you are more than that. And that's one of the things that I think is beautiful about this film. But I have a question for you. And this is the
Mhm.
ultimate question from the film. And I know we're winding down. What happens on Monday? Do
What happens
they
on Monday?
do they remain friends and now new lovers? Are they friends, or do they fall back into their archetypal stereotypes? Like what happens on Monday?
I think they go back to their friend groups, and not because of some kind of moral failure or whatever. I think it's one of those things where when you watch Star Wars and or at the end of I don't know, Return of the Jedi or whatever, where Han and Leia are, you know, kind of canoodling while the fucking Jub Jub band is playing or whatever the fuck the Ewoks are doing. um and you just think to yourself like this is a trope of course in a lot of pop culture of like these couples that are forged in the fires of cinematic trauma, and then as soon as the movie ends it's kind of like Oh, we don't actually have much in common. We just needed to overthrow an empire together, and that's why we
Yeah.
we bonded so strongly. Not that I would say it's like a less extreme version of that is that ultimately, yes, these characters have this sort of universal experience that this film is speaking to, and that they can relate to each other, and their lives certainly overlap. But the contours or the specifics of those lives still do differ pretty significantly. Where, like,
Mm,
you don't have to dislike the band uh, members to just naturally spend more time with the football team if you're on the football team. Like,
mm,
there I think especially at a school like this where there are so many clubs and subgroups that they talk about, where for Molly Ringwald, as they say, it does come off as a little bit more harsh because she is just straight up like, no, I have a friend group and I have, you know, an image to uphold. Whereas the rest of them are kind of just like, no, uh, I'm a sporto and I hang out with other sportos, not because I think they're better people necessarily, but just we do the same thing. We spend our time in the same way. And I think they're not to be like boring about the question, but I think that in my mind is just how it would be. Like, my best friend when I was growing up, literally my first friend, I lived in the house across the street from him, and to this day we're still really close friends. But we were really really tight up through 8th grade because we played football and baseball and basketball together. And then I stopped playing football, baseball, and basketball in high school, and he wasn't on the hockey team. And
mm.
we were still really friendly. We just didn't spend much time together. And now, after high school, we're much closer than we were during high school, just because we don't have like, obviously we still have like our own lives and our own jobs and stuff like that, but we don't have the academic pressure, and he doesn't have a full slate of extracurriculars or whatever. Um,
Right.
and it's also it's easy to keep in touch. We phone and text each other every once in a while. He still lives in Ohio. So it's just stuff like that where I don't think it's a failure on anyone's part that they'll probably kind of sort of sift back into their own groups. Um, but I think there is that question, like the question beneath the question is like, will these people sneer at each other in the hallway? I don't think Bender
Mm,
will. I don't think Anthony Michael Hall will. Um, but of course, those are the guys that,
mm.
have less to
They don't have
lose, as
anything to
Molly
lose.
Ringwald
Yeah.
says. Ali
Mm.
Sheedy is another one of like, it's really kind of the actions on Molly Ringwald and Emilio Estevez. Like,
Yeah.
will they deign to speak to their new friends?
Yeah,
Um,
that's interesting. Like the romantic in me is like, yes, they were changed forever, and they revolutionized the high school, and all of the walls that separate the cliques come crumbling down once Monday.
mhm.
Emilio Estevez walks in hand with Ali Sheedy and Bender and Molly Ringwald. They're making out against the lockers. Yeah, the reality is that probably not, and it might just be of those things where they see each other down the line in college, or they come home from college, and it's kind of like, remember that Saturday that we
Yeah.
spent together? Like, what the hell happened? Why did you
And they give
disappear
each
on
other a
me?
masculine knowing nod. And
Yeah,
they
well,
go their
like
separate ways again.
you can even see the conversation. That's like, what the hell happened? Why did you ignore me on
Yeah.
Monday? You said you weren't going to ignore me. I thought we really
So
clicked. And then they do have a discussion, and they're like, I don't know, blah 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 blah. And exactly like you say, things just got busy. I kind of got sucked into the old habits, yada 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 yada.
yeah. Have you seen St. Elmo's Fire
Again, years ago, years and years and
years
years
ago?
ago.
It's terrible, like, genuinely just a heinous movie. Everyone in it is awful. With, like, a few Ali Sheedy's character isn't half bad. Mayor Winningham is, like, a decent person in it. Other than those 2, like, Every single person in the movie is a terrible person, like just
Okay.
straight up and down. Um, and Judd Nelson in that film plays because they're all recent college grads in the movie. Like I said, it's kind of the college version of this, of where they're on the precipice of adulthood and they're
Mm.
sort of kind of reckoning with the reality that they are all going to go their separate ways. And a lot of the movie's really aggravating conflict is, drawn from the fact that they're kind of like holding on a little too tightly in these final moments. And I know we're supposed to be wrapping up, but whatever. We'll go a little long. Um, Judd Nelson, his whole thing in that movie was like in college, he was the head of the Young Democrats. And now that he's out of college, he's like interning for a Republican senator or something like that. And they're all like, "Oh, you fucking sellout, you're a piece of shit, da 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 da." Um, they say it lovingly. I don't know, whatever. Saying almost it movie sucks.
Yeah.
But the thing that's so funny about it, to me at least, is that you kind of can watch it if you like try to graft the movie onto these characters from The Breakfast Club. Emilio Estevez is like working in a bar and pining after this woman who walks in, and he just
Mm.
immediately is enraptured by her. And I can't remember exactly what Ali Sheedy's deal is because her character's kind of underwritten, but she's sort of I think she's dating Judd Nelson and she's mistreated. And then I think Andrew McCarthy kind of swoops in and proves that he's like the good guy and the sensitive guy, but also Andrew McCarthy's kind of a jerk in the movie. Anyway, the Judd Nelson character for me still, as much as the Emilio Estevez one is like, oh, that can make sense. I can see that, of like a jock who's kind of past his prime, is sort of spinning his
Mm.
wheels, sort of stuck in second gear, doesn't really know what the next part of his life is going to be. And so he fixates his energy on like a romantic relationship. And Ali Sheedy kind of comes out of her shell, gets into a relationship with someone that she knew through the academic years, someone that she trusted, but when that person changes in a really fundamental way, it changes the nature of their relationship, and then she starts to
Mm.
withdraw in kind of the same way that we see her at the beginning of Breakfast Club. Judd Nelson, you would think like, oh, Bender would never, but also Bender would. Like John Bender would be the kind of person who's like former hippie, former rebel, current yuppie, who is like at the end of the day, so much of how he expresses himself in this movie is focused on just like, I just need attention. I need
Mm.
validation. I need people to
Mhm.
kind of acknowledge that I exist. And even if it is like taking the shape of something that's sort of punk or rebellious or, whatever, like what's more fucking criminal than going and working for the Republican Party? Like at a
Mm.
certain point, like, you know, a narcissist is gonna narcissist. And
Yeah.
I think you could kind of make the argument that John Bender is that. Um and so it's just one of those things that I thought I'd throw out there. If anyone has like
Mm.
if anyone's a big Breakfast Club fan and maybe you rewatched it for the podcast and you want like a little a little chaser for your shot of Breakfast Club, I can't recommend Saint Elmo's Fire because it is a legitimately terrible movie about uniformly awful people. But it is just it's a somewhat interesting artifact of like I said, it came out the exact same year as Breakfast Club and did pretty well, but its legacy has more or less just been reduced to like, yeah, the theme song's pretty good, but no one ever really talks about that movie. And you think they would because it's like practically a sequel to an extremely talked about movie from 1985.
I saw it once again ages ago, but to be
Yeah.
honest, I thought it was good just the way people talk about it, but it makes me not even interested to talk about it then.
Yeah, it's Joel Schumacher.
Okay.
And quite famously, I think there was even before he got the movie made, he got feedback from one studio that said much the same thing that I did, that like These people fucking suck. Don't ever bring me shit like this again. Goodbye. Anyway,
Uh, hey, can
it's
we
just
check
kind
in
of like I
on?
said, fun
Can we?
little companion piece. But let's check in. Matt, how are we
Yeah,
doing? How are things
Matt, what's
looking
up
in the
with the
chat?
poll?
The poll is planes, trains, and automobiles still in the lead,
Wow.
59%.
Wow.
Wow. Okay. So out there, if you're listening, make sure you vote in the poll. What it'll be up on YouTube community post
Yep.
Yeah,
and
where
on
where does the
Spotify
poll
or
live?
We'll put a new one on the YouTube community post.
cool.
Okay, so
Six
get
six.
out there. It surprises me that folks are going for Planes, Trains, not because it's a bad movie or whatever, but because you just think of like Breakfast
It's
Club
less
as
known.
this sort of,
Yeah.
yeah, Breakfast Club is kind of a generation defining movie for better or worse.
Yeah.
Whereas Planes, Trains, I feel like even if you can rewatch it once a year, you can kind of only rewatch it once a year. It's such a Thanksgiving movie. Speaking of, I curated this as like, oh, these are two like autumnal movies. Fucking Breakfast Club takes place March 24th, 1984. They say at the very beginning. But I I do not think that prevents it from being an autumn movie.
It's an
Cuz
autumn movie.
like
Yeah.
when I think of this movie, I think of like the overcoats, scarves, the dead trees without any leaves in all the exteriors. He's walking across a football field at the end.
It
There's
looks
something
cold.
cozy about the single
Yeah.
location. It's just one of those things where, like, no matter how many times I've seen this movie, I know it takes place in March, and yet I'm still just like, classic, classic October classic.
But it's
Like, just
before
right
spring has
there.
really sprung. Although I wonder if there is some sort of interesting like spring. There's a lot of talk. We didn't even talk about like the sex. There's a lot of talk about sex in this and like, young people coming to like the spring awakening kind of idea. Pun
Yeah, there's
intended,
a
because
little
that's
bit of that.
my favorite.
That's
There's a little bit of
so we
that. So
let's end on this because this is a point of much controversy in the film. The Ali Sheedy makeover at the end of the movie,
yes.
I think is something that is point of tension for a lot of viewers, where it feels like I've heard it compared to the ending of Grease, where it's like, oh yeah, you can get a boyfriend as long as you change absolutely everything about you. And also, why is getting a boyfriend the point? Why do they feel like they have to pair her up with someone even though that's like not in the movie at all up until that point? I think the thing that Ali Sheedy said in an interview that I thought was actually quite lovely is she's like, no, I don't believe for one second that this is how that character is going to dress and look and do her makeup or whatever from now on. She just it's not about her connecting with Emilio Estevez. It's about her connecting with Molly Ringwald. They have like, a fun kind of moment together. And Ali Sheedy even points out the line where uh Molly Ringwald says like something to the effect of like, why are you letting me do this? And she's like, well, I don't know, you seem like you wanted to do it. Like it's
Yeah.
almost her doing a favor for Molly Ringwald to feel like, yeah, she got to
Oh, that's
do a
fun.
good deed today, when in reality Ali Sheedy's like, well, whatever, man. Like,
And they were all high. They were all high off their
yeah,
heads.
right.
So you do fun stuff when you're high.
Ali Sheedy also said that it was her idea, that in the script John Hughes said like, "Oh, she gives her a makeover and puts on makeup and blah blah blah," blah. And Ali Sheedy was like, "Look, I'm not crazy about the whole idea of it, but if we're gonna do it, let's have me have a bunch of makeup on that she takes off, because it just feels
Mm,
like 1 degree less, less conventional. It feels like a little bit more personable.
mm.
That this is not about me getting dolled up. It's about me revealing myself and being comfortable in my own skin, which, kind of helps things a little bit. But I know the general consensus on film Twitter is just like major glow down for Ali Sheedy at the end of the movie. Never should have let Molly Ringwald touch her.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, cool.
all right.
Let's wrap up. Yeah.
Yeah, let's wrap things up. We hope this was a fun one for you. Like we said, we know these movies are kind of comfort watches for folks, and I feel like there are a lot of people right now who maybe need that. Um, we're gonna be back next week with a movie. We don't know if this is gonna be a comfort watch or not, but it sure looks like a lot of fun. We're covering Gladiator 2, Ridley
I've already
Scott
seen it.
driven back into the Coliseum. You've seen it already?
Saw it. Yep.
Okay.
Went and
Is it a
saw it this
comfort
past
watch?
week. Audiences are gonna see it. There's a lot of people that are gonna see it. That's what I'm
Okay.
gonna say.
All right. I'm
Th
looking forward to being one of them.
it's gonna make a lot of money.
You
I mean,
know, I
it already has done well at the global box office, so
has it.
well, yeah,
Just
because it
watching the
came out
trailer.
internationally before it came out in America. Which is
Oh,
weird.
okay. Eh,
Usually the opposite happens. Yeah.
sure, but I can imagine with a movie like that, like I'll look into what the first Gladiator did worldwide. I can imagine them being like, "Oh no, this is going to play really really well. Like let's get some
It
good
will.
buzz going in other countries, and then by the time it opens up here, maybe people will be
I think
champing at the bit."
lots for us to talk about, like, in terms
I
of,
know.
sequel things, and there's lots to talk about.
Okay, when I saw the trailer, the basic gist that I got was they added Denzel Washington to Gladiator, which to me is a winning formula. It's like, "Okay, ticket for 2, please."
Yeah,
Um, so we'll be back here 7 p.m. Pacific, one more week to discuss Gladiator 2. And then we'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming at 5 p.m. from then on out. On Wisecrack2, that's youtube.com/at wisecrack_2. Don't forget, check out our Letterboxd SMTM pod. You can follow me on Letterboxd at Crematoria. Austin, where can folks say hi to you?
you can hit me up on Twitter, Austin_Hayden, Insta, AUS_HAY. I have a TikTok, Austin.Hayden. Don't really use much of the social media these days, but if you want to chat, send me a DM, send me movie recommendations, anything like that, feel free to do that. And yeah, that's me.
And be sure to fill up that mailbag now that we have the email address as well, wisecrack.smtm@gmail.com. And something fun over there on the Letterboxd. We can keep the conversation going in the comments
Oh
there.
yeah,
We've got, like I said, we posted little, links to the YouTube for each of the episodes that we've done. Jump in the comments there if you have some thoughts on any of these movies, and we'll be kind of
definitely.
poking our heads in, and maybe we'll continue continue the conversation offline or on a different line. But
Sweet.
until then, we all hope that y'all are staying safe, having a good time leading into the holidays. Not much to say other than stay safe out there. Take care of yourselves, and what's a good John Hughes sign off? Don't you forget
Eat
about us.
my shorts.
Eat, yeah. Until next week, when you can eat turkey, eat our shorts. All right.